I would like to present Manos Tsakiris, Professor of Psychology at the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London, where he leads the Lab of Action and Body. He is also Director of the Center for the Politics of Feelings. This newly established center aims to address, from a multidisciplinary perspective, how emotions and their underlying neurophysiological mechanisms shape our political beliefs and behavior, as well as how politics shapes and exploits our emotions in the context of increasing polarization, fake news, social media, and rising populism. This is a newly rising field exploring interesting concepts, and given the current circumstances that we face, its relevance seems to be long-lasting. So I'm very pleased to invite Professor Manos Tsakiris to take the floor and share his insights on ways of feeling the social and political world.
So yes, as Judita said, my talk will be about the relationship between how we feel our bodies, how we experience emotions, and what these could tell us about the ways in which we engage with the social and political world. And as Judita said, I'm leading the Lab of Action and Body at the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. And much of my research is focusing on my own discipline, trying to understand how we become aware of our own bodies, how this body awareness is represented in the brain, how this representation shapes the way we relate to ourselves and to other people. And it's all very much contained within the disciplines of psychology and neuroscience. But what I want to talk to you today has to do with a different project that I was very fortunate to develop in a very different institution, namely the Warbuck Institute at the University of London. Now, what we did at the Warbuck Institute, which is one of the most important institutes devoted to the history of culture, was a project which we called Body and Image in Arts and Science, BIAS. And I want to say a few things about the institute because not many people are aware of it, especially if you're not from the humanities. But I think it's interesting in actually setting the stage for what I want to talk to you about today. So the institute takes its name from Abi Warbuck, who was an important art historian. He came from a very prominent Jewish German family. He was supposed to inherit the first private bank that was created by his dad, but instead he said, I don't want the bank, I just want enough money in my life to buy all the books that I will ever need. And his brother, who was second in line to inherit the bank, agreed to that idea. He didn't know how expensive it would end up being because Abi Warbuck became a very important book collector and a very prominent art historian. And interestingly, from the point of view of interdisciplinarity, Abi Warbuck developed a very new way of classifying books in libraries. So instead of focusing on particular disciplines where you have, philosophy and psychology in one floor and science is another floor, instead he decided to classify the books according to themes. So if you're interested, for example, in the theme of death, you would go in the library and you will find books from many different disciplines that are sitting next to each other as good neighbors, focusing on the same kind of topic. Now, Abi Warbuck had a particular interest in the history of images and how thoughts and ideas travel across time and space via images. And when he died, his library also had to move from Germany to UK because him being Jewish and his family being Jewish, they were under serious threat. Now, another important figure associated with the Institute is Ernst Gombrich, one of the most important art historians of the 20th century. He was also very much interested in interdisciplinarity. And among the many books that he wrote, he also wrote this one on art and illusion, where he said that pictures are relational models of reality. Perception is not a given, but a learned practice involving an active construction of the world. Resemblance to reality is an effect generated by the interplay between the expected and the unexpected. And for those of you who may be following developments in neuroscience and psychology, you may have heard the ideas about predictive coding and the idea that the brain is not a passive receiver of information, but instead is generating predictions about what is out there. And this idea of Ernst Gombrich very much ties into our modern understanding of how the brain works. Another important person associated with the institute is David Friedberg, who was the director there when I joined to develop the BIAS project. Now, David Friedberg wrote a very important book in art history called The Power of Images, Studies in the History and Theory of Response. And in the book, Friedberg makes the following claim. When we see an image of the king, to put it in the classical imperial terms, we respond or are inclined to respond as if the king himself were present. This is both theory and reality, and the obstacle is our reluctance to reinstate emotion as part of cognition. Now, for psychologists and neuroscientists, the idea that emotion plays a central role to cognition is not news. But from the point of view of art historians, that was a quite radical approach, because art historians, they want to have this kind of distance reflective relationship to images and what they depict. But instead, Friedberg makes the argument that we should try to think very carefully about the emotions and by extension, the physiological reactions elicited when we interact with a visual culture. And from the perspective of my research that focuses quite a lot on how we use senses of the body to actually understand the world, these kind of physiological reactions that are generated in our visceral organs, our heart, our lungs, our guts, are very important in shaping our emotions and feelings. Now, this is just to set the stage, because one of the key questions in the Bias project was precisely to ask how do we bodily relate and respond to other human beings around us, the social world, in a culture that it is powered by images. And why do I say that this culture is powered by images? This is a very nice video installation by a video artist based in Brooklyn in the US, who took all the front covers of the New York Times from 1852 to 2017. Those of you who have seen the New York Times, you know that's a very large newspaper with tiny fonts. And you can see that there are not that many images appearing on the front page. Slowly, you start seeing images appearing here and then. These tied to major socio-political events. Eventually, you have the emergence of photojournalism that takes place during the second half of the 20th century. And you see how much more space images start occupying in the front page of the New York Times, up to the point where we have the emergence of color photography with Kodak, and you have an explosion of visual imagery on the front page of the New York Times. Now, this is just an example, because I'm sure you can all appreciate that much of what goes on cultural today, much of the ways in which we consume our news, what you see on your social media, is dominated by images. And I think it's probably some billion of images uploaded on the web every single day. Now, across history, scholars from different disciplines have debated the power of images, the importance that they play. And I think it is right to say that from the beginning of humankind, whether we're talking about, prehistoric art, whether we're talking about religious icons, whether we're talking about paintings in the Middle Age and the Renaissance, or whether we're talking about photojournalism and video and gun faces and deep fake videos and so on, images have always been very powerful cultural agents, shaping the way in which we understand what is going on around us, especially when these things are actually happening away from home. As for example, this morning, we all woke up to the very sad news about the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And we're all seeing the images in our social media and televisions about the Russian troops walking into Ukrainian territory. Now, some images are iconic and have great political capacity. You have probably seen these images that have shaped our understanding of major sociopolitical events. This is an image that maybe you have seen it and you remember it. It documents the kind of tortures that were happening in Iraqi prisons. And what is interesting is that even though the US public opinion was aware of the fact that these things were happening, because for about 18 months, there were articles written in US newspapers about the torture by US soldiers on Iraqi prisoners, the public opinion actually shifted only when these images became publicly available. Similarly, this image of the young boy who was found drowned in a Turkish beach marked the refugee crisis and actually was a catalyst for a change, both in the ways in which the public opinion was viewing the refugee crisis, but also how politicians in Europe actually consider the response towards the refugee crisis, and so on and so forth. Many more images shaping our understanding of what's going on around us, trying to elicit either empathic responses or, in some cases, the opposite, apathetic responses. So one of the key aims of the Bias project was to ask precisely, in which ways this kind of visual imagery elicits empathic responses to most of us, but not to all of us. Here, Katie Hopkins, an infamous journalist from The Sun, she says, "No, I don't care. Show me pictures of coffins, show me bodies floating in water, play violins, and show me skinny people looking sad. I still don't care." So with these insights, it was in November 2016 that we brought together a team with insights from different disciplines, and we set up a psychophysiology lab inside the Warbuck Institute, which, as I said, it's a history of culture institute. They're not used in doing experiments, but I think we're all very excited because we thought that we were following on the dream of Abby Warbuck for a much closer dialogue between different disciplines. So that was November 2016, and we're ready to start asking some important questions about how we relate to visual culture. And soon after we opened up our lab, this is what happened. Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th president of US. And very soon after his inauguration, we started wondering what is real and what is fake. The very concept of alternative facts was introduced in the public jargon. People were debating as to which of the two inaugurations, the Obama or the Trump inauguration, had more people. And the Trump administration was saying, well, it's clear that the Trump inauguration attracted larger crowds. And if you're not of the same opinion, then you have to understand that there may be alternative facts. And soon after that, the Time magazine on its front cover was debating whether truth is dead or whether it is about to die. Now, in that context, the kind of questions we were trying to ask took a very different political flavor. Now, you can think about this image that I'm showing you here, that is probably creating a narrative in your minds about a young refugee child probably falling asleep or sleeping next to what appear to be graves, maybe his parents' graves. And then I can show you this picture and we can start debating as to whether that image that we see, that is supposed to elicit some kind of empathic response in the audience, whether it is real or whether it is staged. And at the same time, in 2016, 17, we all went back to what we used to read when we were teenagers, at least if you're of the same age as I am, and we remembered Hannah Arendt. And in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, I think Hannah Arendt put it very acutely what is at stake, that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule, and back then it could have been Nazism or communism, she was saying is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, in other words, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, in other words, the standards of thought, no longer exist. And I think this is an important passage from Hannah Arendt because she points to the idea of what kind of signals do we actually use to mark, to index the reality of our experience and how this may interact with the kind of cognitive judgments, the standards of thought that we engage in. So this idea of what is real and what is fake didn't appear in 2016. It has a very long history. And of course, it has a very long history in the context of visual culture. This is perhaps one of the most famous anti-war images of all times, the falling soldier from the Spanish Civil War, a picture taken by Robert Capa. But even that picture is debated whether it's actually real or staged, whether it actually shows an event as it happened or whether it was manufactured, staged to elicit specific responses in the viewing audiences. Here I'm showing you three pictures. Two are real. In other words, they depict events as they happen. One is manipulated. It is a montage of the two other images. And I'm not going to tell you the answer. I will just let you wonder and question yourself as to which of the three images is the fake one. Now, how do we distinguish between real and fake images that we consume in the media every day? Framing is important. Depending on where you see the image may influence your judgments. Because if you see the image in a news outlet that you trust, it's more likely that you will believe in what you see. Expertise is important. If you're a photojournalist, if you are a graphic artist, if you're using images quite a lot, you may understand very fast which of these images is actually manipulated, because you may be able to actually understand how the light may be falling differently, what may be the difference in the shadows and so on. And of course, we have photoforensics. I'm referring here to the seminal work of Farid on how you can computationally detect whether images have been manipulated. But from the point of view of our project, we were very much interested in what are our bodily responses when we open our news feed in the morning and we see images like this one. So you wake up, You open your Twitter or your Facebook feed, or you go to the BBC website and you see this kind of image. These kind of images quite often are of aversive kind of nature. They elicit negative, strong negative emotions. And the question is, how do the physiological reactions that we have when we first see these images go on to influence the judgments that we make about what we see? So to approach this question, we collected a series of images that were taken by photojournalists from across the world, and to the best of our knowledge, these images are real. They're not staged. They depict events as they happened, when it happened. And we started slowly by doing some online experiments. So these are just some examples, and you can appreciate the kind of visual imagery that we use, which is quite consistent with what we often see in the media when we are trying to inform ourselves about major sociopolitical events. So we started with one experiment, and I want to emphasize this because it's very important. That was an online experiment, and people signed up for the experiment. And the only instruction that they got was the following. We told them that we're going to show you images, one after the other. And what we want you to do is to tell us how intense the feeling that this image elicits in you, how aroused you are by what you see, right? So they see one image at a time for 4 seconds, and then they have to tell us how arousing was the image, how intense was the feeling that it triggered in you. And they do that for 80 images, and then the participants think that the experiment is over, but we tell them, no, it's not over. We want you now to take part in the second part of the experiment, which is as follows. Now we're going to show you again the same images, and we want you for each image to tell us whether you think the image is real or fake. And we give them a definition of what we mean by real image, an image that depicts an event as it happened when it happened. It was not staged in any way, and the emotions and actions shown are genuine. And a fake image is one that shows a staged event or a manipulated picture that changes the nature or the content of the event. So they're going to go and see the same image again in a new random order for 4 seconds each, and after each image, they have to tell us whether they think the image is real or fake, and how confident they are in their judgment. So here we dissociate in time these two parts, and people don't know at the beginning that they will have to make this kind of judgments, and that's important. So what I'm going to show you now is individual photographs and the kind of arousal levels that they have attracted for all the participants that we test across 3 experiments. So I rank here the individual photographs from the ones that received low arousal to the ones that received high arousal ratings. And in the next slide, I'm going to replace the blue bars with red asterisks, and you're going to see a lot of blue dots. And basically, the blue asterisks show the average levels of arousal for each picture. The blue dots show individual judgments from individual participants. And you can appreciate that for every single individual photograph, there's a little variance. Some people find a particular image very arousing. Some people, they don't find it arousing at all. So these are the data from the first part of the experiment. Now, as I said, in the second part of the experiment, we asked people to make judgments about the realness of the images. And here we compute a probability score of an image being judged as real. So there's a combination of the judgment that people made, whether the image is real or fake, and how confident they are. And anything that's above this dotted red line, above 50, suggests that the image was more likely to be judged as real rather than fake. And you can appreciate that most people for most images actually were more likely to say that the image was real rather than fake. Now, the important thing for us was to try to see whether there's any kind of relationship between the levels of arousal that people described in the first part of the experiment and the probability scores. And what we found was that indeed, the more arousal people experience for individual image in the part 1 of the experiment, the more likely and confident they are to judge this photo as real in the second part of the experiment. Now, this fits with our idea that the kind of physiological engagement that people have when they encounter images goes on to shape the kind of judgments they're going to be making. Another interesting finding was that this relationship between people's subjective arousal and their cognitive judgments was stronger for the older participants. One could think, and this is just a speculation at the moment, that digital natives and digital immigrants engage in different ways with these images of human suffering. Another possibility is that across the age, the lifespan, there may be difference in emotional regulation, differences in people's body awareness and understanding how their interactions with the world makes them feel. These are hypotheses that need to be tested in future studies. Now, after we've done these online studies, we decided to do some blood-based psychophysiology to go beyond people's subjective reports. So this is an experiment that has exactly the same structure. People get information about the first part of the experiment, and only when they've done that, they get information about the second part of the experiment. But also, instead of asking people to give us subjective ratings about the images that they saw, we told them that we're just going to measure your changes in heart rate and skin conductance as two indices of psychophysiological engagement. So they do that for all 80 images. We record the skin conductance changes and heart rate changes. And then when they finish, we told them, we're going to show you the same image again. You have to tell us whether you think the image is real or fake. And as before, consistent with what we found in the first online experiments, we found again this relationship between physiological engagement. Here, smaller heart accelerations and larger heart accelerations were associated with an increased probability of judging an image as being real. So this again suggests the importance of the sympathetic activation in shaping people's beliefs about what they see. And lastly, we went beyond peripheral psychophysiology and we looked at the level of central psychophysiology. So with EEG, we tried to record the heartbeat evoked potential. So this is a cortical signature of the signals that leave the heart and reach the brain on every single heartbeat. And we tried to look whether the amplitude of this heartbeat evoked potential that we recorded when people actually first saw the images in part one could predict the kind of judgments that people would be making in the second part of the experiment. And again, we found that on the basis of the amplitude of the heartbeat evoked potential, we could actually distinguish between the images that people would go on to classify as being more likely to be real versus fake. We've done many other experiments, tried to figure out, what may be the effect of political orientation in this kind of task. We didn't find any evidence that people who may be more liberal or more conservative engage differently. So independently of your political orientation, we would still find this relationship between people's subjective arousal and their judgments. The only case where we found a role for political orientation was a study where we slightly changed the wording. And instead of asking people to tell us whether the images were real or fake, we asked them to tell us whether they thought that the images were taken from an artwork. In other words, they were the product of an artistic creative process, or whether they were taken from a documentary. And in that case, people who were more conservative, they were more likely to say that these images of human suffering were more likely to be taken from an artwork rather than a documentary, perhaps alluding to the idea that conservatives and liberals may be engaging in different ways with human suffering. So what we have shown with this experiment is a crucial role that our physiology may be playing in engaging us with reality and imagery beyond or even before the cognitive processing that kicks in. And feeling and seeing, so the kind of feelings that are generated while we're seeing something, seems to be a strong signal that at least partly determines our beliefs in the realness of a culture powered by images. We find some evidence about interesting age differences, some evidence of the role of political orientation. We also find evidence about the role of alexithymia, which is a subclinical personality trait whereby people that score high on alexithymia are people who are not so good at either recognizing their emotions or verbalizing their emotions. And people who are scoring high on alexithymia were more likely to say that this image of human suffering are more probably fake rather than real. Now, these findings allude to the importance also of cultural and historical factors in shaping our embodied engagement with the social world. And I want to contrast that with what is often an historical perspective in neuroscience in relation to emotions. Of course, we all have basic mechanisms that enable us to feel emotions, but how we experience these emotions, how we express these emotions is always culturally dependent. There may be generational differences. There may be, of course, cultural differences, and so on and so forth. And I think social neuroscience will be benefiting a lot if we could have a closer dialogue with the humanities and social sciences. Now, what's the novelty of our findings? I mean, do we show something that's radically new? Because one could think that what we're actually showing in these experiments is an empirically validated form of a good old existentialism, in the sense that physiological engagement, the magnitude of physiological engagement that we have with the world is actually used to index what is real for us. And I think that resonates a lot with the work that has been done in the last couple of decades in the field of interoception. What I mean by interoception, for those of you who haven't heard the term before, is not introspection. So it has nothing to do with how I think about my thoughts. It is not exteroception, which has to do with how I perceive signals from the outside world, such as visual events. Interoception concerns the awareness that we have of internal states of the body. Think about changing your heart rate. Think about how you're experiencing butterflies in your stomach, or your gut feelings, or changes in your breathing. It has become clear that these spontaneous physiological fluctuations from the internal organs of the body, such as the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the guts, and so on, are quite important for shaping a wide range of cognitive processes. They're important for self-awareness. They're important for a sense of presence in the world. It has been shown to be effective in case of depersonalization and derealization. And we do know that interoceptive signals from these visceral organs go on to shape your visual perception, for example, your awareness of different events in the world. They influence our decision-making, and they do play a crucial role in both physical and mental health. So they're quite important in understanding how we interact with the world, not just on the basis of what we perceive with our senses that are directed outwards, like vision and touch and audition, but also how these are constantly registered against these ongoing spontaneous fluctuations of physiological changes. Now, another important thing that I want to emphasize is that this question of what is real and what is fake is, of course, quite important in the context of what we have been living globally in the last few years. I'm sure you're aware that there are calls from many different disciplines to try and think about the science of fake news. There have been some seminal studies, such as the one that looked at the spread of true and false news on Twitter. That was a mega study that looked at thousands of news stories, identifying which news stories were fake, false, and which were new, and which were true, and looked at how fast and how far false news traveled in comparison to true news. And what they found was that the false news were traveling faster and further. And two important factors were actually determining that. One was novelty, so how novel these false news were in relation to the past history of your Twitter feed, and the kind of emotions, the kind of disgust that these news were actually eliciting in people. So people were more likely to actually retweet and therefore spread more false news if these were novel, unexpected. And remember now the link that I was making with people's expectations, predictions about what is out there, and also when they were eliciting quite strong disgust emotions. Now, we're living in a very interesting landscape, because even though fake stories and fake news have always been around us, I think one should take into account the kind of technological context within which these abilities that we have to actually generate and spread fake news, deep fake images and videos are actually taking place. And thinking about the basis of human communication, one of the basic premises of our communication is that, by and large, we default to truth. We tend to believe what other people are telling us. We have the expectation that other people will believe what we tell them. And this seems to be the truth default theory of the human communication on the basis of civic societies. But the question is, for how long we will be operating in this kind of environment, for how long we will be defaulting to truth if we live in a social technological environment where the a priori assumption is that things are manufactured, things are staged and fake, will be defaulting to truth. And if not, what could be the implications? I think that more than ever before, we actually ask to judge the realness, truthfulness, and trustworthiness of our social world. And you can think about mainstream news, but also social media posts, edited photos and deepfake videos, human and bots, alternative facts and fake news. We have the task and we are asked to judge the veracity of agents and the information they convey. And I think images go at the heart of the matter. I think images play an increasingly crucial role in depicting and shaping the world we live in. There is this turn towards visual global politics and political science. And this turn is based on the idea that goes way back in how we understand images, that images provide this illusion of authenticity. And this is why images are such a powerful tool in modern culture. At the same time, there are very long-standing debates about the political capacity of images, what the photography of suffering is doing, whether it actually engages citizens or whether it actually leaves us apathetic and indifferent. And I think the kind of debates, both in humanities and social science, but also in AI, because AI is particularly getting more involved with how images are generated, how images are transmitted between bots rather than human agents. We need to be thinking a bit more carefully about how we make citizens image literate and when, how we think about the role of emotional regulation and body awareness in understanding how we relate with these images. What do images try to elicit in us? Try to think more about smart citizenship and be aware of the algorithms that may be actually dictating the dissemination of images, and also how these kind of decisions filter into professional awareness when human editors rather than artificial agents or bots may be deciding as to what becomes visible, when and how. Physiological measures and perspective on the body, how these visceral organs that we have sustain our cognitive capacities and how these are actually unfolding in social interactions. Now, the question is whether there's anything new to say, because political emotions have occupied many great minds for thousands of years, from the time of Aristotle and his work on rhetoric to more classical philosophical approaches in the 20th century. Think about Hannah Arendt, and more recently, Martha Nussbaum on political emotions, and of course, quite a lot of work in political psychology. And of course, there are some seminal studies, such as the one that was published in Science about 2 decades ago, showing that, for example, conservatives, they have this different kind of disgust responses to aversive images. A finding that was seminal, but also a finding that has been challenged more recently, where 2 very well-conducted pre-registered studies actually questioned this finding. Now, I think one of the limitations of past work on that was that we think that this relation between physiological responses and people's political attitudes is kind of unidirectional and monothematic. It may be a bit more complex. And I think nowadays we have a more nuanced understanding of the different dimensions of interoception and how these interoceptive states come to be mentalized. In other words, how we make sense of why the world may be feeling the way it does. And I think more interesting work can be done if we have a closer discussion between different disciplines, social and affective neuroscience, political science, and humanities. And I think this discussion is also quite interesting from the point of view of what we may be thinking nowadays about the very nature of emotions, how different political agents may be prescribing emotions, how different technological advances may be enabling the prescription of emotions. And I'm thinking here about affective computing and the idea that you can decode how people feel by analyzing facial expressions or a different set of variables, and how these debates map onto what is the current understanding from the point of view of neuroscience about our relative inability to label our feelings, about the lack of a clear one-to-one mapping between neurophysiological fingerprints and specific emotions, and about how different contexts may actually differentially impact emotional expression. At the same time, it's quite important to understand that affective prescription, emotional labeling is quite important societal factor. this is a very interesting quote by a prominent Republican senator who back in 2012, so long before Trump became president, he said that the demographics for the Republicans are not great because we're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business. And the question is, to what extent we are facing a situation where, for many different societal reasons, large parts of the population are physiologically dysregulated, just because these are the kind of lives we live in. And that was true probably even before the pandemic, let alone what happened with the pandemic. What was the actual net effect on our physiological regulation and homeostasis when we lived in these long periods of existential anxiety, and how this kind of dysregulation may actually pave the way for very challenging and far-reaching effects that have to do with our emotional engagement with politics. So in that sense, we've been putting forward the idea of visceral politics, trying to understand this intersection between the body physiology and political behavior, trying to think how our bodies are feeling quite unsafe at the moment, and how this lack of safety may be actually exploited by different political forces, but also think of a different kind of politics that will actually take into account the importance of actually enabling people to feel safe in their bodies and lead a more or less regulated, physiologically regulated life. We've been doing some work in the area, and these are some proof of concept studies, but I hope I will be having more to say in a couple of years. As part of the work we will be doing at the Center of Politics of Feelings, which is a new interdisciplinary center that we inaugurated at the University of London, where we try to give, hopefully, a more multidisciplinary answer to an age-old question. What does it mean to be a political animal, especially in the 21st century of democratic politics, politics dominated by emotions, alternative facts, social media, precarious health, and populism? And with that, I want to thank all the people who've been doing the research with me, because without them, I wouldn't be able to stand here in front of you and talk to you about these ideas. And thanks to all of you for your attention.